This is Daniel Berman about Boston. We're here with Larry Marks, and today we're going to be covering the 115th running of the Boston Marathon. Larry, today's going to be exciting. Today we have 500,000 spectators today, and some top contenders for winning the Boston Marathon this year. This one's explore just a little bit of the history of the Boston Marathon. Now, when did the marathon first begin?
The first marathon was in 1897. Originally started in Ashland, but they moved it to Hopkinton. As you mentioned, it also, and along the way from Hopkinton to Boston, it attracts some 500,000 spectators and is considered to be the most challenging of marathon courses in the world, thanks to the winding roads and challenging hills.
And in the latest edition of the newspaper, we saw that the top 5 contenders, potential winners for this year's marathon. Any favorites this year?
I really don't have any favorites this year. Last year's winner from Kenya, who had a winning time of 2:05:02. If he is entered, he may have a good chance in winning.
We have 26,800 official participants this year. I mean, that's pretty good.
And all the entrants must meet strict eligibility requirements for being able to run on the marathon.
We're speaking with Holly Hurley, who is our future host of About St. Louis. Holly?
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Some of you guys out there might remember me from Holly and the Lobster
Right.
as well, and perhaps one of my appearances on Daniel's show,
Right.
the
The
Hollywood
Backlot.
Backlot. Yeah, absolutely. We had a lot of fun talking about B-movies.
Yes, we
this
did.
will be a very different conversation.
Absolutely.
Perhaps equally
Right.
as graphic, but...
Probably, yes. Actually, we're here to talk about this year's Boston Marathon and your participation in the Boston Marathon.
Yes.
Let's talk about some of the preparation for this year's 26.5-mile race.
Typically, I like to prepare a little further in advance. I like to start doing my long runs a little further back, but I got my number this year about 2 months before the race, which is enough time to train for a marathon if you're a runner, which I have run before, so I was prepared for that, but it was a short amount of time to kind of gear up. I was already ramping up for a different race and had to kind of switch gears very quickly. So it was a long haul. I think what made it harder this year than I think other races I've trained for was all the snow and the ice. I mean, Boston this year was rotten.
Yes,
I think it's fair to say. And then I finally realized I just have to get out there. If it means, I mean, it was dangerous a couple of days, I actually said, because it was so slippery, you know, out towards Newton, because typically those of us who train for the marathon, you want to train on Comm Ave, because that's where you're going to have your big hill, you know. And so you go out towards Newton, and it just would get slippery, and the roads would be completely blocked with snow. You'd be running, and then all of a sudden it's just blocked, and it's you and traffic. And so that was really, I guess you would say that was a good experience to have. You know, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger.
Certainly does.
And I finished, and I think that's a strong thing to do.
How long did it take you from
Hopkinton
to
Boylston.
To Boylston.
That was, for me this year, unfortunately, it was 4:21, which was what I expected, 4 hours, 21 minutes.
Right.
That's what I expected. I would have liked to do a little bit better if I cut 30 seconds off my starting time and about a minute off my ending time. I could have really come in under 4, and I think had I really pushed it, I could have done that. But I'm really cautious with my marathons, especially because I tend to like to do other things. I compete in other events, I do other races, and I'm not the kind of person I'm not going to win it. So I typically don't go out there trying to go really fast. I just go out there with the attitude of enjoy the day, finish the race. Those are my 2 big goals, you know. And typically by the end of it, nobody's enjoying anything very much, but you finish the race and then you're happy.
Right. It's such a long race to the point, it's almost, 27 miles? Yeah. I mean, how do you prepare physically for something like that?
A lot of it has to do with cross training. A lot of runners get injured because they don't do a lot of cross training. And I mean, even if you do cross train, there's still, in that amount of time, a very high possibility for injury. You know, I mean, that's 4.5 hours. You could get injured in 4.5 hours at work, you know, sitting at your desk. So, you know, never mind, you're running with thousands of other people down the streets of Boston, you know, or whatever that may entail. So I typically would weight lift 2 days a week. I'm a trainer, and so I really believe in strengthening all of the stabilizing muscles. Also for hill work, sometimes it's good to do some strength programs for your legs. And then I teach spinning classes on Tuesday mornings. I did not teach my spin class the day after the marathon. I let that one ride. I gave that one away and took a little nap. Had a little massage, you know, it was nice. But then I did a lot of running, typically 2 to 3 days a week. I don't believe really in training more than 3 or 4 days a week for any runner. I think it's hard enough on the joints that you want to keep it regular, but you want to make sure you're getting your rest and recovery days.
Between work and coming to the gym, I mean, how often did you find yourself in the gym? Because I know a lot of people get distracted with family and they have work and...
It is a commitment. It's a commitment, no doubt. I mean, you literally have to say to yourself, I'm going to be somewhere, you know, you have to have your long day, which is inevitably going to be a 4-hour run, preferably outside, because that kind of distance on treadmill can be very jarring on your body. And so typically you got to say, okay, I got 1 day a week where I'm going to do anywhere from like an hour to a 4-hour run. And then you have the other 5 days a week, you literally just have to set aside an hour. It's hard. Sometimes, if you only have a half hour, you set it aside and you do it. I had to set aside pretty much an hour every day. I would take 1 to 2 rest days a week, and other than that, I'm working out.
Right, that's great.
Well, it's hard. It's not easy, but it is great. It feels good for your body. You know, it's nice to push it. Get there.
What kind of exercises, just particular exercises, do you recommend for such a race like the Boston Marathon, being such a treacherous race?
I typically file for my athletes. I typically file exercises into 2 categories: injury prevention and strength for the actual movements that you do. So, you know, for the strength for the actual movements that you do, things like lunges and step ups, because you're going to be doing hills. And really, if you think about walking or running, it's actually a controlled lunge. You know, it's or an uncontrolled lunge, which makes it even more important to do a controlled lunge. Squats, things like that. Anything that's bending and extending the knees and the hips. And the lunges are especially good in the step-ups because they include some plantar flexion, which is basically fancy wording for pushing through your foot. You know, so you do some of that. You also want to do, preventatively, you want to do some upper back work to get your chest opened up, because a lot of runners tend to get injuries actually in their shoulders from hunching over against the wind. You know, if you look at a lot of runners, you'll see they have kind of hunched shoulders. And it's important to kind of restructure that, work against that. And then I also typically recommend a lot of what we call AB and adduction, or opening and closing of the legs, that sort of sideways movement, because it is the direct opposite of what you do in the race. It actually builds the protective muscles around your knees, your hips, and your ankles to help your body prevent injury. So if you are to have an uneven piece of ground, or if someone was to run into you, your body's got the muscle to kind of snap back into place.
Right. And what got you interested in physical exercise and strength training? I mean, what got you interested in doing this kind of work?
Well, I was a cheerleader in high school, and I was a serious cheerleader. I know that sounds crazy, but I was a 3-time All-American. Oh, wow. And I worked for the National Cheerleading Association. I coached for them. But then after college, I moved away from that into film, into production. And then I got chosen for a reality show. Oh, wow. And I lost 30 pounds in front of a television audience. Before the show, I lost 10 just being nervous about being on TV. And so overall, I lost about 40 pounds in 2 months. Wow. And that experience made me realize, the girls on the show called me the Machine. That was my nickname. And I realized, you know what, if I'm this good at this, I should do this for a living. And that was, on that show is actually where I trained for my first marathon. Wow. I did it all by myself, back and forth on a 1-mile streak. There was one other girl that ran with me, and she went home week 4 out of 7. So I spent literally 3 weeks alone just running back and forth.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, how did you feel after the race? I mean, that must be taking a toll on your body. I mean, how did you deal with that? I mean, with the soreness and after such a long.
Well, you know, the first Boston that I did, I didn't feel too bad after the race, but the day after and the day after that, I felt terrible. My knees were sore. Going downstairs, I would go sideways, you know. But this time around, it was a lot easier. I felt I had a little bit of a stomach upset. I think I had too much Gatorade on the course afterwards, and I was really tired, but I iced my knees, and I put a heat pack on my back for all the tension from the sort of twisting you inevitably will do towards the end of the race, just trying to get to the finish line. And then I was okay by pretty much the next next day. It's about a week after. I'm healed up pretty well.
Right.
I'm feeling pretty good now.
Well,
but
good.
the day of was tough.
Right. Because I didn't realize this until like the last minute. But one of my cousins actually tried to do this year's Boston Marathon. I didn't even know. And what happened was that he actually explained some of his experiences to the family. He came to dinner one night and he was exhausted. He was sore, and he was also aggravated because every joint, his knees, his feet, everything hurt.
Yes.
And he said that he could not eat anything. He couldn't sleep at night. It didn't last long. It was only for like one evening.
Yeah.
But he sat at that table. I can't eat.
You know what's interesting? It affects everyone a little bit differently. I've talked to people who've said, afterwards they couldn't move, or they, my husband had a really hard time with it. The only marathon he's run. He ran Boston last year,
right.
and it was really painful. And I've had different experiences for different marathons. It depends a little bit on the weather, but inevitably, I talked to a physical therapist about this the day after or the week after last year's race, and I said, I'm getting a lot of soreness in my knees, and she's like, yeah, 20 plus miles will make your knees a little bit sore, so you got to think about just the impact of that. I mean, unless you are elite runner weight, unless you're that essential body fat, very light on your feet, there's an enormous amount of pounding coming down on your joints. And even for people like me, I carry a little bit of muscle weight, and that weighs really heavily on your joints. And even if you're strong, you have to be aware of the fact that it's going to hurt.
Right, it is going to hurt. Now, when you run, I mean, is there and there's all kinds of sneakers and shoes that you wear. I mean, what would you recommend for people who are watching at home? I mean, people who are preparing to do upcoming race. I mean, what would you say would be a good fit for, like, say, such a long race? What would you recommend for?
Well, I'm a shoe enthusiast.
Oh, yeah.
I actually got my number. I work at City Sports one day a week simply for the shoe discount. I am that girl, and I have an enormous shoe collection in very bright colors. I'm very picky about my colors, and I typically have a trail shoe. I recommend for people starting to run. You need a trail shoe for the yucky days, for the winter days, for the slippy days, for the rainy days. You want something with some traction that'll hold you up. I use the Brooks Cascadia because it's the brightest color trail shoe you're going to find, and because it's one of the few that I find don't have too much of a platform and stability for a supinator, because I tend to, I'm one of the runners that tends to go more out than in. So I try to keep a nice neutral platform under me. So I really like that shoe. My other running brand, I typically wear Saucony flats or minimalist shoes, and I do one day a week in the Vibram 5 Fingers just to reinforce sort of a lighter heel strike, lighter on your joints. I typically do my fast days in those, like a pace day, a really quick day, 3 miles, 6 miles, something like that.
And how many marathons have you been in? Small? I mean, what else have you done as far as races?
Well, the marathon, this is my second year to do Boston. Larry helped me cover it last year, and I know you did too. You got to have a good conversation with my mother-in-law. And this is my second year to do Boston. I did, my first marathon was on that reality show by myself, and I ran it in a 10-pound weighted vest, and I'm very sad to say I ran it in about 10 minutes faster than I did it without the vest. So if you're wondering, apparently it's a pound a minute when it comes to your mileage. Apparently that's what it is, because 10-pound vest equals a 2:30 marathon. No 10-pound vest equals 4:21.
Oh, wow.
But those are the only marathons I've done at this point. Past that, I did a half in preparation. I did the New Bedford half. Ran it pretty quick, about 1:48, which was fast for me. And then I do 5Ks. And 5Ks I can go anywhere from running in like a 6.5-minute mile to running like a 10-minute mile, depending on how easy I'm taking it. Whether or not I'm really taking it as a workout or a race, or whether or not I'm just kind of hanging out, just kind of doing it to do it.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. What else do you? I mean, outside of the racing, I mean, what else do you like to do? I mean, you say there's other events that you like to participate in.
Well, I'm doing the Tough Mudder in Vermont later this month, and I'm going to do the Reach the Beach Relay, which is a relay race that you do with 11 of your closest friends. It's 200 miles from one end to the other. So I do a lot of running events. I still like to play sports, although I don't get to do as much of those as I used to. I do triathlons, but I used to play soccer and do stuff like that. I always try to find something new. I studied Krav Maga for a little while, the sort of fighting style of the Israeli army. I think when it comes to your body, if you want to stay fit, one of the most important things to do is to keep it interesting. Don't be afraid afraid to try something new, and you may not be good at it, but try it. You know, you may like team sports better than you like exercising at the gym. Fine, go join a team and be there. Make a commitment to be there. You know, I mean, if I'm preaching about fitness, that's what I say. But for me, it's like just doing something feels good.
Right. How does your body react when you have to run such a long race? I mean, does it get tired right away? Or are you full of energy first, and then you're like, oh, geez, it's like 15 miles into it, and you're like, oh, no, I got to still run more.
Well, I had a friend who said you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your level of training. And I know there are exceptions to every rule, and I've seen that exception in a marathon, and boy, that's infuriating. But, you know, but the truth of the matter is if you train yourself at a certain pace, if you find when you're running and you're comfortable and you can keep going, maybe it's going to be hard. At a certain point, no matter who you are, you're going to hit that point where it's not easy to keep running. But for some people, you also pass that point and get into the point where it's harder to stop, you know? And then once you stop, you're like, wow, everything hurts. But, you know, it catches up with you later. But essentially, it's different for everybody. For me, the hardest part of the marathon is typically after that. I play a lot of mind games with myself. I'm one of these people who says, well, you've already done 8, you know, it's only 3 times this to the end or something like that. You know, I play mind games with myself a little bit while I'm running. And, you know, once you get to 10, you're like, oh, come on, you know, hardly anything to go, you know. And but because of those games, the hardest part for me is typically between the half and between mile 17. Because especially on the Boston course, those areas are a little more sparse when it comes to people, a little more sparsely populated. You know, once you pass Wellesley and all the girls are screaming and, you know, everybody's in the streets, and then all of a sudden it's like 2 or 3 guys here and there, people having barbecues, but not really that kind of wall of screaming fans, you know. And that area can be tough both for the motivation, because nobody's like watching you per se, no one would see it if you didn't run, but also because of the fact that at that point you're not close enough yet to see the end, but you're too far away from the starting line to see where you've come from. And I think that is, for a lot of people, that's a place where they struggle.
When you're running in the Boston Marathon, knowing how long it is, I mean, how do you keep yourself mentally in there? I mean, without falling apart.
Like I said, a lot of it is the games. I would tell anybody who's going to do the Boston Marathon, write your name somewhere on your person, down your arm, somewhere where everyone can see it, because you are wanting people to yell your name. It's motivational to know that somebody's saying, go you, you know? And then I would say the other part of it is, you know, I say it's mind games, but you got to keep that positive attitude of all I have to do is cross that finish line. And, you know, for people who, that the distance is an issue for, because there are people for whom 26.2 is just not a long race. But for the other people, it's, you know, it's the issue of I just have to cross the finish line. That's all I have to do, you know, and keeping the focus of just not stopping, just realizing that you don't want to say you went out for this and you didn't do it. You want to say you finished, and that all you have to do is finish, and that carries a lot of people through.
Well, listen, Holly, thank you so much for joining us. We're about Boston.
Cool.
Thanks, you.
Dan.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for doing this interview.
Thank you.
Okay, we're here with Holly, who just completed running this year's marathon, and I just wondered, how do you think you did in this year's marathon as compared to last year's marathon?
I think I did a lot better. Hopkinton to Ashland was just all fun and games. You know, you're waving at people, people are ringing cowbells, it's just a good time. And then you hit Ashland and you're like, okay, I'm in another town, thank God. And then Wellesley is always my favorite part of the marathon.
And how do you think you did on the hills, especially Heartbreak Hill, going through Newton?
Well, it's funny because I've always been one of these people who likes hills. I train for them, I'm ready for them. And then you get to Heartbreak Hill, and it's one of those things where I didn't necessarily notice that I was on Heartbreak Hill or that I was finished with Heartbreak Hill, but I definitely noticed, you know, my body felt like it was running for almost the first time in the race. It was like, oh boy, you know, you kind of felt like you're slogging through Heartbreak Hill.
How did you do when you continued on Commonwealth Avenue and then you had to go down Chestnut Hill Avenue and you had to make a left onto Beacon Street?
Well, the coolest thing, I think, this year, I didn't notice this last year, but it could be because I was really slow last year, but as we got to the end of Boston College, there's this huge thing that says, like, Heartbreak Hill is quit, or, like, Heartbreak Hill is done, or something like that, and you're like, oh, yes! And then after that, I sort of got a little boost because you have, people are screaming for you basically straight through from there through Brookline, all the way into, all the way down the big turn around and coming around that turn to Boylston. I was running with another girl, and I said to her, when we cross this turn, you're going to see the finish line, and it's going to be beautiful. And it just is. People just screaming on either side, huge sign, and you're going down there and you see the end, and you're just like, man, I finished the Boston Marathon. I think that last part is hands down the best part. I think everybody would say that, but it's neat.
When you finally crossed the finish line, did somebody run out, and just wrap you in a blanket?
Unfortunately, they sort of let you meander through after the finish line. What you don't see on TV is there's this huge chute, and you literally, you in like a mile from the finish line because you have to go through first. They they give you water bottles, then they try to give you this Gatorade recovery stuff that tastes just awful, but you're so thirsty you'll drink almost anything. And then they give you a sack full of food that has potato chips in it, which is the last thing you want. And then they wrap you in this huge, then they give you the aluminum blanket. They ask you if you want it, which some people say no because they're still warm for the race, but it's always cold outside, and so people who don't take it typically end up having to be wheelchaired somewhere. So you take the blanket, you put the blanket on, then you have to go find the bus that has your bag of stuff in it. Then you can hit the porta potties, which inevitably you'll need to do, and then you have to get out of the chute area to find your loved ones who are there, hopefully, purportedly, unless you are a very strong runner, to carry you home.
And I guess that we're probably going to attempt to make a field trip to St. Louis to catch up with you.
Well, I would love that. Maybe do a Holly and the Lobster St. Louis style?
Yeah.
Maybe go on a riverboat?
Yeah. Take a look at the St. Louis Arch.
I think that sounds like a lot of fun. I think we could do that.
Yeah. Well, sounds good.
I look forward to that, Larry.
Okay. So, Dan, did you have a lot of fun this year?
Oh, I had a great time this year at the 115th running of the Boston Marathon. It was a great time. I enjoyed myself tremendously.
Okay, good. So, what say we come back and do it again next year?
Oh, I'm looking forward to the 116th running. I'll be here.
This is About Boston, and we'll catch you next year for the 116th running of the Boston Marathon.